At 39 years old, Eleanor Mae Whitcomb stood at the edge of the Larkspur rail yard with $11 sewn into the hem of her one good skirt, and nowhere on God's earth that she could call home. Her brother-in-law Tobias Wren had put her out of the farmhouse 3 weeks past, the same farmhouse her husband Daniel had built with his own two hands before consumption took him the winter prior, and Tobias had done it with a Bible verse on his lips and a deed in his pocket that said the land was his now by blood and by law. All Eleanor had left in the world was that $11, a trunk of her late husband's tools, and a stubbornness that had not yet learned to quit. So when the auctioneer at the rail depot in Larkspur, Nebraska, called out that a derelict caboose car, rusted, windowless, sitting forgotten on a dead spur of track behind the old freight house, would go to whoever paid its back taxes, Eleanor raised her hand before her mind had finished deciding and bought it for $6. The men around her laughed. A woman alone buying a railroad car nobody wanted to live in like some kind of vagrant hermit. But what none of them knew, what Eleanor herself could not have dreamed as she pressed her last coins into the assessor's palm, was that tucked beneath the splintered floorboards of that car's only remaining seat lay a folded letter that would unravel everything she believed about her mother, her own birth, and the family she thought had simply forgotten her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Mae Whitcomb. If this story finds a tender place in you, we'd love to hear in the comments which moment touched you most. Stories like Eleanor's are kept alive by people like you. Eleanor had been born in 1858 in a sod house outside Concordia, Kansas, the second of 4 children to Ruth and Samuel Voss, a family that owned little but gave generously of what they had. Her father broke prairie sod for other men's farms before he ever broke his own, and her mother, Ruth, kept a kitchen that smelled always of yeast and wood smoke, a kitchen where no traveler was ever turned away hungry even when the Voss family's own larder held barely enough. It was from Ruth that Eleanor learned the quiet, exacting art of preserving, how to can peaches in their own syrup so they tasted of July even in the dead of February, how to render lard so clean it never turned, how to stitch a quilt from flour sacks so carefully that strangers mistook it for store-bought cloth. Ruth used to say that a woman's hands told the truth about her heart, and that idle hands bred idle sorrow. Eleanor took this to heart the way some children take to scripture, repeating it to herself in the long hours of butter churning and bread kneading that filled her girlhood. There was warmth in that sod house despite its dirt walls and its single smoking lamp, and Eleanor carried the memory of it the way other people carried photographs, worn soft at the edges from handling but never faded. What troubled Eleanor, even as a girl, was the silence that fell over her mother whenever certain subjects arose. Ruth would not speak of her own mother, would not speak of the years before she married Samuel Voss, would not even say with certainty where she herself had been born. When Eleanor asked, as children do, Ruth's face would close like a door drawn shut against weather, and she would busy her hands with something, mending, scrubbing, anything, until the question passed. Eleanor's older brother Asa once told her in a whisper that their mother had come west alone as a young woman with no family of her own, and that this was simply a fact the family did not discuss, the way some families did not discuss a grave that had never been properly marked. Eleanor accepted this as one accepts weather, something beyond her power to question, though it left in her a small, persistent ache, a sense that there was a room in her mother's life whose door she would never be permitted to open. When Eleanor was 19, she married Daniel Whitcomb, a quiet, broad-shouldered carpenter's son from the same county, and together they pushed further west into Nebraska territory, drawn by cheap land and the promise that hard work might finally yield something that belonged to no one's mercy but their own. Daniel built their house plank by plank on 160 acres outside Larkspur, and Eleanor turned that house into a home with the same patient, exacting hands her mother had given her. She kept hens. She put up preserves every autumn until the cellar shelves groaned. She nursed Daniel's mother through her final illness without complaint, and she buried 2 infants before they ever drew a second breath. Grief she folded into herself the way she folded linen. Neat and contained and never spoken of unless asked. She and Daniel never had a child who lived past its first winter, and this sorrow sat between them for years like a third presence in the house, until I simply learned to love each other around the shape of it. Ruth had died in 1889 and Samuel 2 years after, and by the time Eleanor stood in the rail yard at Larkspur, she had already buried more people she loved than she had fingers to count them on. And yet she had always had Daniel, and the farm, and the rhythm of seasons that asked nothing of her but labor and gave back in return a kind of peace. Then came the autumn of 1897, when Daniel's cough would not leave him, when the cough became fever, and the fever became the long, terrible stillness of a man wasting before his wife's eyes despite every poultice and every prayer Eleanor knew how to offer. He died in February of 1898 in the bed he had built with his own hands, and Eleanor washed his body herself, as was proper, and dressed him in his church clothes, and stood at his grave in a wind so cold it seemed to want to strip the flesh from her bones. She thought in her grief that she had already endured the worst the world could ask of her. She was wrong. Daniel's brother Tobias had never cared for Eleanor. He had wanted Daniel to take a wife with land of her own, a wife who would have brought more to the marriage than calloused hands and a kind heart. And he had never forgiven Eleanor, in some unspoken corner of himself, for being merely what she was. Within a month of Daniel's burial, Tobias produced a deed, drawn up years before in a moment of brotherly trust Daniel had never thought to mention to his wife, granting Tobias rights to the land should Daniel die without a living heir. Eleanor had no child to inherit, no paper of her own to contest it, and no money to hire a lawyer who might have found the deed's claims thinner than they appeared. The county judge, a friend of Tobias's from church, upheld the document without much delay. Eleanor was given 3 weeks to remove herself and whatever she could carry. She packed Daniel's tools, her mother's quilt, a Bible, and the $11 that remained from selling her hens and her good Sunday dishes to neighbors who paid her less than they were worth and knew it. She walked to Larkspur with her trunk on a borrowed cart, and she did not know when she arrived where she would sleep that night. It was the auctioneer's voice that drew her to the rail yard. A crowd had gathered, mostly out of idle curiosity, to watch the county sell off neglected property for unpaid taxes. A routine humiliation visited upon whatever had been abandoned long enough to become an eyesore. Eleanor stood at the back of the crowd with nothing to bid on and no reason to be there except that she had nowhere else to go, and that was when she saw it. An old caboose car, the kind that once rode at the tail end of freight trains carrying brakemen and lanterns, now shunted onto a dead spur behind the depot and left to rot. Its red paint gone gray, one window boarded, the door hanging crooked on a single hinge. The auctioneer called it worthless, said the railroad had abandoned its claim years before, and the county simply wanted the back taxes paid so they could stop carrying it on the books. $6, he said, almost apologetically, as if embarrassed to ask for even that much. Something in Eleanor, not logic, not plan, but some deeper animal instinct toward shelter made her raise her hand. The men nearby chuckled, one of them muttering that a woman buying a railcar to live in was a sorrier sight than the car itself. But Eleanor paid her $6 to the assessor without meeting anyone's eyes, and just like that, the caboose was hers. She had $5 left to her name and a structure with no proper floor in places, no stove, and rust creeping up its iron fittings like a slow disease. But it had walls, it had a roof, and it was hers in a way the farmhouse, in the end, had never truly been. She spent her first night in the caboose wrapped in her mother's quilt, listening to the wind find every gap in the boards, and she told herself this was temporary, a place to stand while she figured out what came next. In the gray hour before dawn, unable to sleep, she began the work that was as natural to her as breathing. She started to clean. She swept years of dust and mouse leavings from the floor. She scrubbed at the iron stove fittings with sand and rag. And when she came to the single built-in bench seat that ran along one wall, the kind brakemen once used to nap between shifts, she noticed the seat's wooden base was loose, one corner lifted as though it had been pried up and never properly reset. Curious, and with nothing else to occupy the long, lonely morning, Eleanor worked her fingers beneath the seat's edge and lifted the board free. Beneath it, wedged into a shallow cavity clearly never meant to hold anything but the seat's own framing, lay a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, dry and intact despite what must have been years of neglect. Eleanor's heart, already raw from grief, began to pound with a feeling she could not name, not quite hope, not quite fear, but some cousin to both. She unwrapped the cloth with trembling fingers and found a single folded letter, the paper yellowed and brittle at its creases, along with a small tin-type photograph of a young woman she did not recognize and a man's pocket watch stopped, its case engraved with initials that were not her own. She sat on the cold floor of that caboose for a long while simply holding these objects, feeling the strange electric certainty that she had stumbled into something that was never meant to be found by a stranger, and yet had somehow waited patiently for exactly her. The letter was dated 1858, the very year of Eleanor's own birth, and it was addressed simply to my daughter, with no name given, as though the writer had not known what name the child would carry or had not dared to write it down. Eleanor unfolded it with the particular care she gave to anything fragile and began to read, and within the first lines she understood that she was holding her mother's hand across nearly 40 years. The letter was written by Ruth, though it took Eleanor several trembling rereadings to be certain, for the hand was younger, looser, full of an anguish Eleanor had never once seen her composed and capable mother display in life. Ruth wrote that she was writing from a railroad work camp in eastern Nebraska Territory, where she had fled as an unmarried girl of 17, pregnant and disowned by a father who would not have a bastard grandchild under his roof. She wrote that the baby's father, a young surveyor named Charles Prout who had promised marriage and then vanished west with the railroad survey crews when her condition became known, had left her with nothing but his pocket watch, which she had stolen from his coat in a fury the night she learned the truth, and which she could not bring herself to sell, though she did not say why. Ruth wrote that she had given birth alone, attended only by a camp cook's wife, in the caboose car that served as the work crew's only shelter from the weather, and that for 3 days afterward, too weak to travel and too ashamed to send word to anyone who might judge her, she had nursed her daughter in that very car, on that very seat, wrapped in the only blanket she owned. But Ruth's letter went further, and here Eleanor's breath caught entirely. For Ruth confessed that she had not been able to keep the child, not out of want of love, for she wrote that she loved her daughter more than my own ruined name deserves, but because she had no money and no Chinese letter, no way to feed an infant while also finding honest work, and because a childless couple traveling with the rail crew, a Mr. and Mrs. Voss, had lost their own infant to fever not 2 months before and had looked upon Ruth's baby with such naked, grieving longing that Ruth, in her desperation and her love both, had made an arrangement with them. She would give them the child to raise as their own, on the condition that she herself be allowed to travel onward with the same rail crew as a laundress, so that she might never be far from her daughter even if she could never claim her. Ruth wrote that she meant to tell her daughter the truth someday, when the girl was grown enough to understand that a mother's love and a mother's capability to provide were sometimes two entirely separate things, torn apart by a cruelty of circumstance rather than any failure of heart. Eleanor understood, reading this, with a dizziness that made the caboose seem to tilt around her, that the Mrs. Voss of the letter was her own mother, Ruth Voss, the woman who had raised her, but that the woman who had written the letter, the woman who had given birth to her on this very seat in this very car, was also named Ruth. They were, impossibly and yet with a terrible internal logic, one and the same. Ruth had given her own daughter to a childless couple, and then, Eleanor could only assume, piecing the dates together with shaking hands, something had happened to that arrangement, some turn Eleanor did not yet understand, that had eventually placed the very same baby back into Ruth's own arms, so that Ruth had raised in the end the daughter she had once given away, without ever finding the courage to explain how strange and circular that journey had truly been. Eleanor sat with this for the better part of a day, unable to eat, unable to do anything but turn the pocket watch over and over in her palm, tracing the initials CP that were not Voss and not Whitcomb, but belonged to a man named Charles Prout who was, by every honest reading of the letter, her true father. She thought of her mother's closed face whenever questions of family arose, the door shutting each time as though against weather, and she understood now that the weather Ruth had been guarding against was not a storm of the past but a storm of shame, a fear that if Eleanor ever knew the truth, that she had been given away once, that her own mother had handed her to strangers in a moment of desperate love, she would feel herself somehow less wanted, less truly a daughter than children who had never been parted from their mothers at all. It took Eleanor nearly a week to piece together, through the letter's careful but incomplete account, what must have happened next. Ruth had traveled with the rail crew as promised, working as a laundress, watching from a careful distance as the Vosses doted on the infant they believed was a gift from Providence to replace the child fever had taken. But within months, Samuel Voss had been gravely injured in a trestle collapse, and Mrs. Voss, the original Mrs. Voss, Eleanor now understood, a separate woman entirely from her own mother Ruth, had been forced to return east to her own family for help, unable to keep an infant while nursing an injured husband and facing a journey of uncertain length. In her own desperation, that first Mrs. Voss had turned to the laundress who had shown such tender, persistent attention to the baby all along, the woman everyone on the rail crew assumed was simply a doting family friend, and asked if Ruth might keep the child temporarily until the Vosses could send for her. Ruth had agreed with a joy she dared not show too plainly. But the injured Samuel Voss had died of his wounds within the month, and the grieving Mrs. Voss, alone and without resources, had never sent for the child at all, perhaps believing it crueler to disrupt the baby's life a second time than to simply let her go. Ruth, given by fate the very thing she had sacrificed to provide for her daughter in the first place, had quietly taken the Voss name as her own when she later married a different Samuel. A Voss cousin, as it happened, met through the tangled, intermarrying threads of frontier rail communities, and had raised Eleanor as the daughter of that second marriage, never speaking a word of the truth, perhaps believing the kindest thing she could do was bury the chaos of it entirely and simply love the child plainly. In the present tense, without the burden of an impossible explanation. Eleanor wept for 2 days over this knowledge, not from anger but from a grief so layered she could not at first separate its strands. Grief for a mother who had carried this secret alone for 40 years. Grief for a father she had never known existed and would never meet. Grief for the sheer loneliness of what Ruth must have endured, smiling through church suppers and quilting bees while holding inside her a truth so enormous it could have swallowed her whole. But beneath the grief, slowly, something else began to surface, something that felt almost like relief. The door that had always stood closed in her mother's face was open now, and what lay behind it was not rejection but the opposite. A love so fierce it had reshaped itself twice, had crossed an entire territory and 3 names and 2 marriages, simply to remain near its daughter. Word of Eleanor's caboose had by then spread through Larkspur as the kind of curious gossip small towns cannot resist, and it reached the ears of Tobias Wren, who arrived one afternoon with the self-satisfied air of a man who believes he has already won every argument worth having. He had heard, he said, that Eleanor was making a spectacle of herself, living like a beggar on railroad property, and that it reflected poorly on the Whitcomb name, a name he seemed to feel he alone now had the right to protect, having claimed the land that bore it. He suggested, not quite kindly, that Eleanor ought to leave Larkspur altogether, perhaps go east to whatever family she had left, so as not to embarrass herself further in a town that had known her as a respectable farmer's wife. Eleanor, who in her grief over Daniel might once have absorbed such words in silence, found instead that the letter beneath the floorboard had given her something she had not possessed in weeks. A sense of her own lineage, fragile but real, a thread connecting her to women who had survived far worse than a brother-in-law's contempt. She told Tobias, with a calm that surprised them both, that she would leave Larkspur when she herself decided it was time, and not one day before, and that he was welcome to inform the church ladies of whatever spectacle he believed her to be making, since she found she no longer much cared what they thought of a woman who owned, outright and without debt to any man, $6 worth of iron and timber that nobody else in this county had wanted. But the deeper conflict, the one Eleanor had not anticipated, came from the rail company itself. A clerk from the regional line, hearing through the same gossip network that an old caboose had been sold off and that something of apparent value, a pocket watch, people whispered, though the truth had been twisted and exaggerated by the time it traveled, had been found inside it, arrived in Larkspur to inform Eleanor that any items found within railroad property, even abandoned property, were legally the company's to claim, and that she would need to surrender the watch and letter for review. Eleanor, who had buried a husband, lost a farm, and only just recovered a mother's hidden history, found in herself a steel she had not known she possessed. She informed the clerk, in front of two witnesses she had deliberately gathered from the depot office, that the letter was addressed to her by name in spirit if not in ink, written by a woman who could be proven, through county marriage and birth records still on file in Concordia, Kansas, to be her own mother, and that no company policy on freight could lay claim to a mother's private words to her child, words that had nothing whatsoever to do with railroad commerce. She added with a quiet steadiness that seemed to unsettle the clerk more than any shouting could have, that she would be glad to let the matter be decided by a judge and a newspaper both, since she suspected the company would find itself the villain of a story Nebraska readers would not soon forget, a grieving widow's family letter, seized by a railroad for the crime of having been hidden too well. The clerk left within the hour and did not return. It was the pocket watch in the end that opened the final door. Eleanor, determined to learn whatever else might be known of Charles Prout, the surveyor who had vanished west, wrote to the regional land office in Cheyenne, including a careful description of the watch's engraving, and received in reply, after some weeks, a letter from an elderly land surveyor who remembered a Charles Prout from his early working days. A man, he wrote, who had died unmarried in 1881. Having struck a modest claim in Wyoming territory that had eventually proven valuable when later surveys ran a spur line directly across it. A claim that, lacking any known heir, had reverted to the territory and then the state for lack of a legal successor. Eleanor realized, with a feeling like the floor opening beneath her a second time, that she might well be the only living blood relation of a man who had died believing he had no child in the world at all, and that this fact, properly documented through the same county records that proved Ruth's marriages and Eleanor's birth, might entitle her to whatever remained of an unclaimed estate the state had been holding, unclaimed for nearly 2 decades. The legal process took the better part of a year, and Eleanor pursued it not with greed but with a steady, dignified persistence that won her, slowly, the respect of even those in Larkspur who had once laughed at her purchase of the caboose. She did not seek vengeance against Tobias, though she might have used her eventual means to contest the farmhouse deed. Instead, she let that grievance rest, deciding that some doors once closed were better left that way, and that dignity lay not in winning every battle but in choosing which ones were worth her remaining strength. What she did do, when the Wyoming claim was finally settled in her favor, was modest by any measure of frontier fortune, but vast by the measure of a woman who had owned nothing but $11 a year before. Enough to purchase a small house in Larkspur outright, enough to open a little shop selling her preserves and her quilts to travelers passing through on the very rail line that had once carried her mother as a frightened girl of 17, and enough, crucially, to commission a proper headstone for Ruth's grave, one that finally bore beneath her name the words "beloved mother, twice given, never lost," words only Eleanor and a very few others would ever understand the full weight of, but which she knew. In some way she could not entirely explain even to herself. Her mother would have wept to read. She kept the caboose. She had it moved at no small expense onto a corner of the lot beside her new little house, and she restored it herself, plank by plank, the same way Daniel had once built their farmhouse, sanding away the rust, replacing the broken window, repainting the iron a deep, defiant red. She did not live in it any longer, not after the house was built, but she kept the bench seat exactly as she had found it, loose board and all, and she would sit there some evenings with a cup of tea, simply resting her hand against the wood where her mother had once lain weak and ashamed and fiercely loving, where Eleanor herself had drawn her very first breath, though it would take 39 more years and a $6 act of desperation for her to learn that fact at all. This is, in the end, the story of Eleanor Mae Whitcomb, a woman who at 39 had nothing left in the world but $11 and her late husband's tools, who paid $6 for a rusted, abandoned railroad car that no one else would touch, and who found beneath its seat not merely a forgotten letter but the truth of her own birth, the shape of her mother's secret sacrifice, and a connection to a father she had known to mourn. What was restored to Eleanor was never simply money, though the money mattered and gave her a roof that no brother-in-law could take by deed or trickery. What was truly restored was the understanding that she had never, not for one day of her life, been unwanted, that the silences she had once mistaken for distance had in fact been the sound of a mother protecting her from a grief too large and too strange to easily explain, and that love, even when it must travel in secret, even when it must wear a borrowed name for 40 years, does not diminish for the disguise. Eleanor had bought a railroad car believing she was purchasing nothing more than shelter from the wind. What she had truly purchased, it turned out, was the rest of her own story. We thank you truly for spending this time with Eleanor and her story. And if her journey moved something in you, we hope you'll consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear that what looks like loss can sometimes be carrying a long-delayed gift. Before you go, we'd love to ask you something to sit with. Is there a silence in your own family's history, a question never quite asked, an old object never quite explained, that you've sometimes wondered might be holding more love in it than anyone ever found the words to say aloud? We'd be glad to hear your thoughts below. Until the next story finds you, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.